There you go. So now that we're officially on tape, I welcome everyone here. And Brenda, our lone virtual attendant. Great to have you with us.
Okay. It's always great to be here, Michael. Thank you.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear them, Brenda? Can you hear them?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Can they hear me?
Yes. Perfect. So we're in sync.
Perfect.
All right. So as much as I would love to talk about oxen and and mules that go astray, there was something that attracted me very much about last week's Parsha, and particularly a student from the rabbinical school at JTS who shared some interesting perspectives. And I wanted to look into that a little bit on Parshat Yitro. And we'll touch on Mishpatim very briefly at the end, just so you don't think that it's completely out of sync with the calendar. So what I found fascinating about this approach is something that we perhaps take for granted in our relationships. I think we're aware of them, we acknowledge it, but we don't always abide by understanding of that. You're probably wondering, what's he talking about? So I think in relationships, one of the most significant elements of a successful relationship is how those who are involved in a relationship perceive boundaries, what that boundary means. And in Parshat Yitro, there are so many references to the boundaries, and we'll begin with the text, with the boundaries between God and humanity in general, but specifically with the Israelites, including the leadership and the people at Mount Sinai. So we're just gonna take a look at a couple of verses so you have an idea of the words used, and then we'll try to explore that a little further. So if you look at chapter 19, verse 12, if you're in the 8th Chaim, that's for you, Brenda. And if you're in the 8th Chaim,
verse 12?
Yeah, chapter 19, verse 12, we're in Parshat Yitro, and in the 8th Chaim, you can find that on page 439.
I got it.
All right. So I'll just wait for you to get there. And as this talks about you're aware of the preparatory process that the Israelites undergo in order to be ready to receive Torah at Sinai, however we define that, and however we understand and perceive that incredibly complicated description of exactly what happened. And we're not going to go so much into that. The element we want to look at is what was required of the Israelites and Moses and the leadership in terms of where they should be when revelation takes place. Where is everyone supposed to be? If you think about any ceremony that you participate in, there's a very clear choreography. Everyone needs to know where they are going to be sitting or standing. I remember my daughter's graduation ceremony not too many months ago from college, where there was a very strict understanding of where the audience sat, partly determined by COVID, but not only, where the dignitaries were on the stage, whose hands every graduate was going to shake when they walked by, and where people enter, where they leave. It was very clear where everyone stood. And nobody, as I observed, I didn't pay attention to it at the time, nobody crossed those boundaries. They were super clear where everybody stands. Even when you're shaking somebody's hand, you don't step into their face, you walk by, you shake their hand, you keep going. You don't cross some imaginary line. The dignitaries don't leave the stage until they're asked to do so. The audience doesn't leave their seats until the ceremony's over. Everybody has to be in their place. And so if you think about what is understandably seen as the greatest ceremony in the history, you might say humanity, but certainly of the Jewish people, and as they were referred to before, the Israelites, Revelation is that. So what happens at Revelation? How does that ceremony take place? Where are people situated or located when that's about to happen? Okay, so we know when they leave Egypt, we know all the events that happen. We know that they come to Mount Sinai, Har Chorev, as it's referred to, and they camp there around the mountain, whatever that looked like. But as they prepare, and they're about to have some kind of encounter with God. They don't know what to expect. Where are those supposed to be when that takes place? So let's look at verse 12. I'll read verse 11 first. Let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. So that already says something, because when we talk about a ceremony, it's not just where the people are there, it's every entity in that ceremony, including God. Where is God going to be during that ceremony? Because that is going to impact on where everybody else is. Lahavdil, as we say, to differentiate. When there's a guest speaker or dignitaries at a ceremony, where are they going to be as opposed to everyone else? So, I mean, I'm not calling God a mere dignitary, but perhaps at least one side of the revelation encounter, where is that side going to be, meaning God? Okay, so
it's all orchestrated.
It's very much orchestrated in a very confusing manner if you look at the text, but there is orchestration nevertheless. It might not sound like a work by Mozart or Beethoven, and more like some kind of contemporary, maybe a Schoenberg kind of orchestration, but nevertheless, there is orchestration here. Okay, so what does verse 12 say? Pay attention to the word. I'm going to read the Hebrew because the Hebrew is very important. V'higbalta et ha'am saviv lemor hishamru lachem alot bahar ungoa bekatzehu kol hanogea bahar mot yumat. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. And I continue in English. No hand shall touch him. Him meaning the mountain, because mountain is in the masculine. We're not talking about God. We're not talking about God. Yeah, no, we're not talking about God. No hand shall touch. It really should be it, but because in Hebrew it's gender, in the English they translate it with gender as well, rather than calling it an it. Interesting. So no hand shall touch him, the mountain, but he shall be either stoned or shot, beast or man, he shall not live. Meaning, not only you're not allowed to approach it, but you can't even, let's say there's a line there, you can't reach over the line. That line extends completely upwards, so you can't cross with any part of your body that line and touch it. That line extends around the mountain, so supposedly. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. So hold it. Where does that come from all of a sudden? Didn't we just say the mountain, whoever touches the mountain, let alone goes up, it shall be put to death. And all of a sudden, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. So what exactly is happening here? There is a clear border, and look at the Hebrew word, the higbalta. Lehagbil in Hebrew means to limit, to mitigate. Coming from the Hebrew word gvul is the noun of that. Gvul is a border or a boundary. So lehagbiloto. We talk about sometimes somebody who is disabled, physically, mentally, emotionally challenged. We talk about them having some kind of hagbala. They have some kind of limitation, some kind of situation or circumstance which limits what they're able to do in whatever way. So we use that. Migbalot are limitations. So this word, as always in Hebrew, the root can be taken in all sorts of different directions. In any case, we're talking about really not so much the modern Hebrew meaning of limiting them, although you can understand that as well. Put a border, a gvul, around the mountain, and they will be limited from accessing the mountain by that border, imaginary or otherwise. Whether they, when they say set bounds, I'm not sure if it says anything here about anything, any kind of construct, that's another issue, or whether it's just set bounds, say that they can't approach the mountain. It's not clear whether it's an instruction only, verbally offered, or if they're to build some kind of physical structure so they know we can't go by here. Maybe that's part of why they needed 3 days in order to prepare. So they'd have a chance to put up some kind of screen or limiting element in a physical sense around the mountain so nobody would approach.
Want some clarification. So is this talking to Moses what he should say? Or is this Moses telling them already?
Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. God says to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure, and tomorrow let them wash their clothes, let them be. I didn't give you the introduction. So this is God speaking to Moses, Moses conveying that message to the people. It's an excellent question because we're going to come back to that in a moment, this idea of intermediary. Okay, so great question. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. All right, so it sounds rather clear. The mountain is out of bounds. They're not supposed to come up the mountain. Why? Let's look further. Keep in mind this idea that at some point, they may go up on the mountain. Okay, keep that in mind. Don't forget that.
Was Moses still up on the mountain?
Yes, he was, because the following sentence says he came down.
He can't. Yeah.
He came down, but yeah. Okay, so
up.
he's up and down a little bit on the mountain, and we're going to come back to that in a second. Okay. So then it says, if you think about it, where would Moses be in order to most effectively convey the message? He has to receive it from God, but he's too high up on the mountain. They're not going to hear him. Although you may want to be in an elevated spot. If you remember Charlton Heston standing on some higher rock from which he could throw the tablets down. Anyway, so for staging purposes, he was probably standing somewhere, but maybe not on the mountain that was forbidden. Okay, it's a good point though, because if we're talking about choreography and everybody's place during this event, we want to try to have a clear idea where everyone is, so we have an idea of the impact.
You should talk to Cecil B. DeMille. Right.
That where Cecil B. DeMille had the idea about where Cecil B. DeMille got all his information is a whole study in itself. Yeah. We're not going to go into that right now. Okay.
Michael,
yeah.
It also says, be prepared after a 3-day period. Do not draw near a woman.
Okay, wait. I'm not there yet. Hold it.
I'm reading ahead.
No, don't read ahead. Stay together. So Moses comes down from the mountain to the people and warned them to stay pure, and they wash their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the 3rd day. Do not go near a woman. Okay, so where did God instruct Moses to tell the people not to go near a woman? Nowhere in the text. So what's this idea about not going near a woman? Where do you think that comes from? And how does that tie in what we're talking about?
The Orthodox. I'm just being mean. Yeah.
So this idea, but seriously, this idea that we read that very traditionally, conventionally, and I'd say impacted by the way we see relationships between men and women, not in a contemporary way, but in terms of perhaps Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox law. Don't go near a woman. Why? Woman's contaminated. You got to be pure. You got to ready yourself. That's commentary. Don't go near a woman because, let's face it, who is Moses probably speaking to? Probably to the men. But why might he say, don't go near a woman? Again, this idea of boundaries and choreography. You might say, why shouldn't a couple and a family all be together to experience revelation? So it's not saying that. It's saying during the 3 days of preparation. It says quite clearly to stay pure and wash their clothes during that 3-day period. Be ready for the 3rd day. Do not go near a woman. It doesn't say, it's easy to say, don't go near a woman and stay away from that woman during revelation as well. It's also possible, and I'm not saying which makes more sense. That's part of our ability and desire to interpret in certain ways. It says maybe don't go near a woman so you can prepare. Why is that? Because the Torah possibly respects the relationships between men and women. There's an intimacy there. And we want you to be focused on preparing. It's not because you'll be contaminated. It's because you want to prepare yourself for something. And if you're preoccupied with the mundane, and I don't say that in any negative way, the usual relationships that exist between men and women, you may not allow yourself to prepare properly. You need to have some kind of perhaps isolation in order to properly emotionally and intellectually prepare for this big event that's happening in 3 days.
Sorry, I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions. First of all, it's which women? That's my first question, because there was also all this idolatry women. So that's number 1. And number 2, The question is, if the male-female relationship is understood as kiddushin, kadosh, then why wouldn't it be the exact opposite if it meant conjugal relationships for purification? Wouldn't those conjugal relationships create more of kiddushin than less?
Possibly. I'm not saying.
I'm just kind of
Yeah,
curious, because it's considered to be as close as we can in human understanding to kiddushin, right? So if we're trying to prepare for kadosh, and that's the ultimate human experience of kiddushin, then it doesn't seem a little bit confusing.
It could be, but perhaps in preparing, and again, this is all
just like because I'm sitting here going,
right.
I really wondered about that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that isn't as legitimate or relevant as what I'm suggesting.
Right.
There are many different ways of looking at this, and you might say that denying that opportunity to engage in that holy relationship between men and women, you're not allowing them perhaps to prepare for the holiness of a relationship with God, because we often see God and our relationship with God as a people between God, a man and wife in traditional ways.
Unless those relationships were not good at this point in time, because they had come out of Egypt. So
Karen, it's a great question. Think about the term you're using, kiddushin, the holiness of relationship. First of all, it's a wonderful way of looking at relationships, pre-Torah, pre-rabbinical understanding of the nature of relationships between men and women. And as you say, they just came out of Egypt. They haven't got a clue about understanding how that relationship should be something holy, as our tradition determines and over a period of centuries through rabbinic interpretation. But when they come out of Egypt, they don't see, it's unlikely that they see, at least in the same way, the relationships between men and women as something holy. Think about slaves. Do slaves have time to regard that relationship as something that has the opportunity for something beyond perhaps some more basic desire and practical need of bringing children into the world, as holy as that may be? But the understanding and concept of the holiness of relationship, I would suggest, is unlikely something that most recently experiencing slaves thought about.
That's how I read it. I read it that they weren't prepared at that moment in those conjugal relationships as holy.
And so,
that's
which is why this makes sense. But not
sense.
as a denigration of women, which make men impure, or women's menstrual cycle and all the physiological issues that we consider impurity. I don't think that's what this is about, because those don't exist yet. We haven't received those set of instructions yet from God. So we haven't got a clue about that. But this idea of purifying yourself, try to abstain from things that are more, at least at this point in your understanding, of an animal nature, as opposed to the unique human element.
But it also shows, unfortunately, and we now live in a time of egalitarianism, but really that the writing of this is from a male perspective. In other words, if it was an equal perspective, it would say, but be ready in the third day, man should not go near a woman, and a woman should not go near a man. It's not written that way. It's addressed to men, which unfortunately over time turns out to be quite out of date.
Right. Or to take that to the extreme, and of course that's a certain perspective. Stay away from your partner, whoever that partner may be, as opposed to just man and women. But of course, that's a very contemporary way of reading it, which probably is not relevant.
It can seem common completely, but it's simply that it seems. I'm sure there are many other examples in the Torah where unfortunately it's addressed to men.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's no question, and very few people would argue the fact that this is most often from a male-oriented perspective. Most of what we read in the Torah, not everything, but much of it. And there are ways of finding the female element and perspective here as well. Sometimes we have to search a little harder for that, but that's there as well. But that's another discussion. I want to try to. So before you ask your question, let me just continue on a little bit, and then I'll give you a chance. Okay. So let's just take a look at a couple more elements of this idea of boundaries. The the mountain's getting all fiery and smoky. And if we look at verse 19, the blare of the horn grew louder and louder as Moses spoke. God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Okay, so here is a major element of choreography. God, whom we often see as omnipresent, why is it important to describe God here in anthropomorphic terms, even though nobody sees God? Why does the Torah have to describe? Nobody sees God except for maybe Moses. I don't know. Why is it necessary to say that God descends to onto the mountain? God is already there. Why does God have to descend to the mountain? Why do we need to say that in the text? Why is that important?
Because it's a revelation. It's so that we can understand God in the way that we might be able to understand God at that point. So in this case, God reveals God's self in a very specific way to be understood.
Okay. So we when it says God comes down onto the mountain, and you may have intended this as well, maybe not. Mm-hmm. So there is this, we often talk in Kabbalistic terms, the idea of God limiting God's self in order to make room for humanity in the universe. Because if God is omnipresent and takes up all the space, where is there room for humanity? That's a Kabbalistic way of looking at things. But here, this is something somewhat similar. If God is perceived as being everywhere, then where is there room for us humans, even around the mountain? I mean, we're here, we understand that, but how can we possibly encounter God if God is already everywhere? Where are we going to encounter God? How can we perceive that engaging with God if we can't limit and make God finite enough for us to perceive something? So along the lines of what you said, there is perhaps this physical understanding of God's limitation, but as well, there is God's expressing God's self in a way that humanity can understand, not just through what God does, because God we are saying is manifest everywhere in the world, from an ant creating a hill, or from an enemy's ox grazing in your backyard. So God is in everything, but we need to have some kind of ability to perceive God more specifically. And so both in terms of location, we're at this mountain. We're not allowed to go up on that mountain. Why? God is going to come down on this mountain. And we don't want to be, or maybe we do, in the same place where God is going to be physically. But more importantly, God is going to express what God has to say and share with humanity in a way that we can understand through Moses.
It's a transfer of power. It's a transfer or an interactional sense of power, where God actually gave Moses the ability to absorb whatever was there, and in turn the people could see. So the word coming from Moses then would have much more impact, because there was an exchange. Moses then took on a different place. So there actually was a change in balance.
And we see that more when we go because initially it says in that last verse I just read, it's interesting, it says, Moshe Yadaber v'ha Elohim yanenu v'kol. We talked about that I spoke about that last week briefly, where it says Moses spoke and God responded with a voice. Hold it. Shouldn't it be the other way around? God spoke and Moses conveyed that to the people. This seems to be going in opposite directions. So there's a fascinating commentary that's saying, what does that mean? Along the lines of what you said, God transfers an authority and power to Moses to be able to speak. And God responds by saying, yeah, that's okay. Moses, you got the idea. You're right. God is approving of what Moses said after Moses has been able to, through empowerment from God, to understand that divine message and convey to the people. And God says, yeah, you got that right. Doggone. That's exactly what I was thinking.
To that point, doesn't the way in which God reveals God's self transform from up on the mountain and then later goes, because Moses almost demands it, that God comes down after the golden calf into the camp in the form of a cloud-like formation. So in other words, God also responds to Moses' request to come down off the mountain. So it goes from high up in the mountain right into the camps in an appearance, a transformational revelation from up on top towards being on the ground, rooted on the ground within the camp amongst the people. It's such a transformation of how God reveals God's self.
And we've also seen this.
But in response to Moses' request.
But we've even seen this before, because God is manifest in a pillar of fire and of cloud as the Israelites travel through the desert. So one at night and one at day. So there is some kind of physical manifestation, visible manifestation of God already from the time they are approaching the Yam Suf.
Right, and then even later, Talmudically, don't the rabbis kick God out? Because basically they say, don't intervene. We're now here with our laws here. Like, you're revealing yourself, and then they basically say, and now it's our interpretation.
That's
there's a movement from
the story talks about a voice from heaven.
Right.
Not any kind of physical, but that's
But it kind of moves from up here.
It can be any sensual encounter with God. It doesn't have to be visible. It can be like,
so it goes from up here,
right,
up on the mountain where nobody can sort of access except for down on the bottom, to moving into the camp, which is now amongst the people as they have the laws, to start to grapple with the laws as they're kind of nomadic, to finally, after we receive the laws, after we're kicked out of the promised land, into the place where we ourselves have to figure out the laws in the modern world, and said, okay, no intervention, please. We're figuring it out.
And that's part of what this is saying here by having Moses speak first, and then God kind of approves.
Right, because then that's the beginning of that thing that we can have modern.
We can interpret things, and you have the authority and the ability to interpret things. Don't think you need to wait for me, God, to give you further. I'm giving you a template. Take this template and work with it. And I'm giving you the authority. So whatever you say, that's properly based, of course, I'm going to approve. This carte blanche, you might say, in a way, God's giving Moses and those authorized instructors following Moses to be able to interpret and teach and direct and lead the people.
So I'm understanding that Moses is the tangible connection between God and the people.
It seems to be.
How you talk to air.
But still, it says, and so I think the beauty is right here, because when we talk about boundaries and rules and borders, whether it's between nations or what we expect with regards to parents and children and whatever relationship, that's it. You've crossed the boundary. You've crossed that red line. So we use that phrase because it's important for us to delineate what we have access and where we have access to, and what we allow access from others. And I think the most fascinating thing in this parsha is this verse here: Vayered Adonai al Har Sinai al Rosh Har, Vayikra Adonai leMoshe al Rosh Har, Vayal Moshe. So God comes down to the mountain. It says, Vayered Adonai al Har Sinai el Rosh Har, right to the top of the mountain. So what does that mean? Was God touching the mountain? Is the mountain over that line? And Moses climbs up to Rosh Har, the same place, Vayal Moshe. So they're both at this place, al Rosh Har. Whether they're touching, like in that Michelangelo, I don't know, but the creation. But they're right there at this place where we often refer to as, and there's a wonderful film which we'll be seeing in March called Periphery, it's another, but this idea of being right at the edge and not being sure exactly where one thing ends and the other begins. Wow. So where's the periphery of heaven and the periphery of the mountain meet? Do they cross? Do they intersect? Or are they touching, or just with that infinitesimally small gap between them that they shouldn't touch, because God and humanity perhaps may never. In Michelangelo's painting Creation, those fingers are not touching. They're separated. They're reaching for one another, a spark between perhaps, but they're not touching. And so perhaps this reaching between God and Moses right at the top, Al Rosh Hahar, is that same expression of the attempt, and not always successful attempt, of God to touch humanity and humanity to touch God. They strive for that connection, but are they ever able really to connect in whatever way possible? So that's why I find this verse the most fascinating. And of course, if we look further on, we talk about the confusion with the people, whether in fact they're able to go up, and God says to Moses, okay, you understand, we may not have touched, but I think you got the sense of what I'm trying to convey to people. Go down there, because even though you've told them, somebody may climb up on that mountain. And if this is our closest approach to our some kind of physical or meaningful or relevant encounter, the people's red line is somewhere else. You have a different red line. As an authority, as Moses, you're allowed access beyond the borders and boundaries of what other people are limited by. The people have a much lower limitation where they're allowed. And it says, go down there before some of them. And even the priests who come near the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them. So hold it. What's he saying here? The Kohanim also who come near the Lord must stay pure. What do you mean come near the Lord? Is their boundary different than the people's? Are they allowed up on the mountain? Are they allowed up to where Moses is? It's not clear. Not clear. So there is some kind of uncertainty about a hierarchy of accessibility and boundaries. And so God says to Moses, go down before somebody crosses their respective boundaries. And Moses said, hold it. Lo yuchalam. The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it. So the Lord said to him, go down and come back together with Aaron, but let not the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So now, what wasn't clear before, okay, so not all the priests, but Aaron is in a similar category to Moses, but maybe not quite. Aaron's going to come up the mountain, but is Aaron going to go as high as Rosh Hahar, where God had descended to before in order to engage with Moses? It's not clear.
Again, later on, I mean, so this is such a contrast to when God comes down, like in the count, and says that you'll all be priests. It's going to be amongst all of the nation. So you're all priests. So isn't that exact rule setting that you're saying, the boundary setting, in this scenario, completely in contrast to the later equalization that happens in the camp? Because there seems to be a breakdown of that concept completely later. So it says that there's not that hierarchy kind of gets kind of broken down.
Maybe the question is, I can just interrupt.
Sure.
The hierarchy, does it stay or does it move? And in which directions does the process go?
So already here it's moving. I mean, God gave certain instructions, but already we see some kind of clarification or uncertainty about who can go where, who is in what place on this pyramid of power. Moses at the top, Aaron, the rest of the priests, perhaps the Levites, the firstborn, before they've lost their authority, and the rest of the people, and even, women beneath that.
Even the assembly that was created not even by Moses, but by a non-Jewish father-in-law, right? The assembly. So is that hierarchy? So again, who's defining the hierarchy is my question here. And is that hierarchy not allowed to be, restructured? As I said, even when we see later passages how that hierarchy can be completely dismantled and reorganized in the later context.
Well, does this set the stage for the various laws that are coming, the judiciary, the criminal, the religious, the Does that?
So beautiful, because we could spend more time on this, and there are more verses to look at. But I want to finish with this point here, because that's exactly where I wanted to connect. So we're talking about, and we're not here to resolve things. We're here to question and leave more confused than we began, of course. But this idea of boundaries and borders and accessibility applies to law as well, because different institutions have different responsibilities, and they have their boundaries for their type of authority. And when we cross those boundaries and allow various institutions to cross into the authority of others is when things get very tricky. So, for example, now, and I don't hesitate to state this, and I mentioned this before, the crossover from executive power into judicial power, taking authority to make decisions on things which should be, at least in our democratic, conventional democratic thinking, that should be left for some kind of independent authority, such as the judicial system. That's when borders and boundaries have been crossed, and it becomes dangerous. Not dangerous, perhaps, in the physical sense of the people going up on the mountain and being struck by lightning or whatever, but this idea of if authority can be taken by, if too much authority can be taken where the authority has been divided up for the benefit of society as we understand it in a democracy, then it becomes dangerous, because people will not be struck down by lightning, but they'll be struck down by laws that become not the kind of laws that we would like to be following. And we see that happening in many different places. And what you mentioned about Jethro, about Moses, what does Jethro do? Jethro does something similar, not so much this, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, but he talks about division of authority among those who have, and we talked about this last week, about different abilities and skills. So there's an authority of those who can deal with 1,000, those who can deal with 100, those who can deal with 10. Each of those have their own bordered and bounded authority based on what we see as an appropriate division of labor. Moses is not going to be able to manage everything. And so Moses has to be protected. He has to have his boundaries. We talk about it again. We talk about it in our workspace. When we're taking on work, you have to create boundaries and borders between allowing your work to creep into your family life, and vice versa, of course, vice versa. So boundaries, again, it's not fair to try to discuss all these elements and manifestations in a 45-minute discussion, but boundaries apply in so many different ways in our lives. Sometimes we're not sufficiently aware or acknowledge the importance of those borders and boundaries, not just in our relationships within our family, but in the workplace, our relationship with God, however we see that. Does it make sense for us to get to Rosh Hahar or beyond? Icarus certainly tried. But there are many different ways in which we try to understand, acknowledge, accept, or disregard borders or boundaries in our multifaceted lives. Anyway, just a few things for thought today. And delegating, yeah.
Michael?
So Brenda's been so patiently quiet. Let's give Brenda a chance, okay.
I've forgotten half of the question I was going to ask you, but the point is that the reason why it's Moses who has to come down and relay all of this to the people, they will see him as one of them. If God were to come down, I don't think the people would recognize it or respect it, because they still don't understand the whole concept of a God who has Moses and everybody else trying to get their 2 cents, their 2 cents in. And I was going to mention Yitro too. Yitro said to him, he said, "You're not going to be able to manage all of this. You need to divide the power up."
Right. Thank you. Bela?
My question really relates to the way the people were set apart. It almost appears as if it was the men who were invited to the party and the women weren't. So is this where, the giving of Torah is to men, as opposed to, like, the women are not really invited to this one? It doesn't state that it's families, it's women, it says everybody, but it doesn't really say everybody.
So I think a majority of commentators say that when we talk about revelation, we talk about everyone. It talks even about that multitudes who were not Israelites, who joined them leaving Egypt, took advantage of a chance to get out of slavery, and they were all part of Revelation. So everyone was there,
as well as future generations.
As well as future generations.
Every man,
woman, and slave. Right.
So, but it was the way they set out the borders. That's what I'm wondering. The way they, you know, how they all had assigned seating, so to speak. Like were the borders this way, like a centric, like a, you know, like
concentric circles around. Could be. I don't know.
Interesting, because
we don't see when we imagine it, we imagine some face of a mountain.
Yeah.
You don't imagine. I don't think you imagine people encircling a huge mountain. It's just too wide and expanse. But you imagine a huge multiple spreading out in front of you in one direction. But I mean, I think the image, as Karen, I think, correctly stated, if you look at the text, there's no reason to assume that women were not part of this revelation.
Well, they all heard it. They also heard it on the bottom.
Yeah, everybody was there.
So might have been up there on the hierarchy where they wanted to be. But meanwhile, everybody heard it.
But there were so many exclusionary, like who checked you out? Like at the doorstep, did they say, did you do something?
No, I don't. I think the limitation was to go up the mountain. The limitation wasn't to approach the mountain. I think anybody who was around,
In a couple of places, it says the people.
The people.
So when it says
men,
the
women,
people,
no, they actually
and they say men, women,
Yes. That's the part.
It's just the way women are still.
So we see that both in Mishpatim later on when we talk about the Naseh and Ishma element later on in the Parsha. You also see that in Parshat Ki Tisa when we read about the golden calf. So when we get to that, we'll maybe have a chance to make a little bit of a comparison.
I was just going to jump ahead to the golden calf because I'm talking about the women getting
yesterday, and I'd like to go back into her text about what she said. I know it's sitting because I had to clean the shelves yesterday, so I know exactly where it is. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Brenda.
See you next time. Be well. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Oh, right. Shabbat shalom.
Thursday. Yeah.